Greetings, friends. Arhangelske here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of April 29th through May 5th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment your thoughts. And share this video around. So this week we have a lot of updates, and we're going to continue focusing on our favorite part of the front. Well, at least the one that's been the most active. The Donetsk front, specifically on the Avdiivka section of it. So this week we have a lot more clarifications, and the Arhangelske flower is blooming. So this week basically got a lot of the Russians are continuously expanding, and what happened this week is we got a lot more clarifications on where the Russians actually are in this expanding flower. So first, we basically got confirmation that all of Arhangelske has been captured by the Russians. We've got geolocated footage of the Russians in all these areas before, and before it was just kind of like hearsay. We knew they were there, but we didn't have exact geolocated footage. But now we have the Russians have complete control over Chechnya, and because of that, the Russians are expanding in every direction. Let's talk about the eastern direction. Apologies. So in the eastern direction, this is where a lot of actually the big events happened this week. So let's talk about what happened. Now, last week I talked about how I mentioned how Novokalynove and Kremik were captured, but I said we didn't really have confirmation yet. But I said that regardless, because the Russians controlled at least the eastern part of those villages and or Chechnya, they would fall. And this week we got confirmation that they fell. First of all, we have geolocated footage of the Russians raising their flags in the center of Kremik. We saw Russia, and because of that, and because of another update that happened later in the week, we basically got confirmation that the entire area got captured. So this week, the villages of Kremik and Novokalynove have been captured by the Russians in full, which was very surprising. My biggest surprise is how the Russians were able to expand on this eastern section, because the Ukrainians still have positions here. It's not like this area collapsed, unlike the on the more western side. So I'm kind of surprised they're able to push out and capture Novokalynove and Kremik. But these two towns got captured, and you might be wondering, how did they do that? Well, basically, it's like, again, it's the Arhangelske flower. Because of, again, the whole thing about this war right now is that it's not a mobile war. It's an attrition war. But it's not just attrition for the sake of attrition. Each side is trying to improve the tactical situation on the front. And basically, the thing is that when you capture a certain tactical objective, you are able to exploit that to be able to expand and better your defenses or capture an important part of the front. So, for example, as we talked about the Arhangelske flower blooming, basically the capture of this town basically facilitated the fall of Novokalynove and Kremik. So, while as before, when the front line was along this rail line, the Ukrainians could, they had secure flanks, and it was a very, it was a lot easier for the Ukrainians to defend Novokalynove. So, but however, when Arhangelske fell, then that facilitated the fall of these two villages. Now, another big thing that happened besides the confirmation that Kremik Novokalynove has fallen is the capture of Arhangelske. And this village of Arhangelske has also been confirmed, not just hearsay, but also we have geolocated footage of Ukrainians leaving here, and also of Russians raising their flag in one of these buildings. So the capture of Arhangelske, it was a culmination of the capture of Chechnya, the capture of these two towns, because now the Ukrainians are in this little pickle where they're being attacked by two sides, and they had to give up. And because of that, the Ukrainians had a very strong, actually, defensive node here. It was like somewhere right here. In this area, the Ukrainians had a very strong stronghold, and this was the last thing to fall, because once they got cut off from the west, and once these two villages got captured, and they started attacking this way, and the Russians started attacking this way, then they were about to get cut off, and so they had to give up and retreat toward Arhangelske, which was captured after a few days of fighting. So this eastern expansion of the Russians taking these three villages is very significant. This is very big progress in terms of how the war is going. So you might be going, okay, so they now secure. What's next in this way? So the next thing is actually going to be a bit easier for the Ukrainians. So the Russians took what they the towns that were going to fall because of Arhangelske being captured. But however, now if they continue moving north from here, the Russians have a bit of a problem. there's a bunch of water barriers here. There's a water barrier here. There's a water barrier here. Water barrier here. And so the Ukrainians are now trying to are having new positions on the other side of these water barriers in Kalinova. They have like positions here. They have positions up here, here. And so the Russians, if they continue wanting to move north, are going to have there's some natural obstacles. And because of that, I actually expect this front to slow down a bit. I don't think we'll see much progress from here for a little bit. I think they're going to start focusing more on the western side instead of the eastern side. But they took as much as they could and secured their flanks on the eastern side of Arhangelske. So that's what they needed here. I do not think, obviously you might be, the goal here is that they want to continue pushing the Ukrainians so that they don't just settle in and just rebuild a defense line. However, the thing is that these are natural defense lines. The fall of Arhangelske might have made the Ukrainians not been able to, they might have not expected an attack from the flank because they would have expected Arhangelske to still be holding. They had Arhangelske was the defense line, but if that fell, then Arhangelsk was going to fall. They didn't have enough defenses in here, for example. Here is that even if the Ukrainians don't have a much man-made fortifications in these like little villages, they have these water barriers right here. You could see it on the map here. That allowed the Ukrainians some natural defenses that actually would slow down the Russians. And also the Russians need to, if they want to keep going north, continue. And again, I talked about this last week about the two purposes of this, where they want to cut the highway between Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk, so they go up, kind of more of in a northwestern direction. They also want, once Chasiv Yar falls, they will want to link up somewhere between Konstantinovka and Toretsk and surround the Toretsk, New York cities. So these are the two objectives, and so. They obviously want to continue going north, but again, they need to secure their flanks a bit. So a combination of that, their flanks need to be more secure, and the fact that continuously going north, trying to take Kalinova, Stary Manolovka, and Zorova are with water barriers, I think we're going to see a pause in this. The Russians basically cleared up and secured the flanks in their Arhangelske, and so this is the new front line that the Russians have, but I don't expect the Russians to continue moving north. But that's just, maybe the Ukrainians are so defeated the Russians will be able to cross these water barriers pretty easily. I don't know. We'll see. But the capture of these three villages is very significant. The Russians have secured their flanks. They are continuously, so it's very solid progress from the Russians here. On the more on the western side of this, is the Russians are also, and this is where I think the Russians are going to focus a little bit on, again, they need to secure their flanks a bit, is that Russian sources are saying the battle for Novokalynove has begun, and that the Russians are basically on the outskirts of this town, like right here. And one thing that is that while the Russians have expanded, are trying to basically find some sort of natural, a new defense plate, again, here on the western, on the eastern side, you have a natural defense line here, so even if you pause here, you could defend yourself here. Here, they're trying to basically create that buffer zone. And, again, this is where, they were going to reach this kind of like intersection here. It's very easy to reach here. It's very close, relatively speaking. And so, but it's like if they can't reach that, where will they make a new defense line so that they could continue, if they have to stop, if the Ukrainians manage to plug the hole, where can they actually defend themselves easy? They don't want to expand and then realize they're out of gas and have to retreat. And and the thing is, there's a lot of these open fields here, and the Russians need to basically move along this rail line and kind of find, like, and my theory, and this is where I think it's going, is that the Russians, and this will help facilitate if you look more in the south. So they're going to move along this rail line. They're going to try to take Novokalynove to secure their kind of northern flank. They're going to use this rail line to secure their southern flank here. And then once it's something, and then they're going to continue pushing north, pushing to the west. And I think the goal of this Russian push to the west is to reach the village of Poris, which is kind of like, I would call it the gate village to, this is the, once the Russians reach this village, this is the gateway to, the difference between the Ukrainian defenses near Avdiivka and Donetsk versus Ukrainian defenses that are starting to be set up for the city of Pokrovsk. So this is why there's as the Russians push away from Donetsk and Avdiivka and push towards Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk, this is a major Ukrainian city. Let me show you it. You guys don't know. This is the city, and this is holds the western defenses of Donbass. The main Ukrainian defense line is here in Slavyansk to Terezhk, this area. However, then there's still this western part of Donetsk that, even the Russians capture this, the main stronghold, the main base, the main defense line, they still have to take Pokrovsk. So, starting the battles for Pokrovsk would be very bad for the Ukrainians. And so, as the Russians reach Porez, again, this will push the Ukrainians away from all their defenses this is starting to reach the defenses for Pokrovsk outside of the defenses for Avdiivka. And so let's talk about what the Russians might do. So the Russians might push to Porez. Let's say this is where they are. Let's say the front line kind of goes something like this, right? And then once that happens, I think the Russians will either they'll start, and this is the hard part. I don't know, the Russians could push here. They could continue pushing and try to actually cut the highway, which is kind of the main goal of the Russians. However, also, they have to understand that if they manage to push here, right, let's say the front line goes something like this, right? Well, then, look, there's a bit of a big salient here, right? So they'll have to push more to the north here. And I think what the Russians are going to do is try to outflank this. If they could outflank, again, they might not be able to push across from a direct push across these water barriers, but they might be able to expand from this kind of, they could take, this kind of circle from Porez to Novokalynove. This is a small enough salient that they could defend it. Going up to this highway would make the salient too much of a salient, and their flanks would be exposed. To secure their flanks a bit, what I think is going to happen is they're going to use this base out here to expand and outflank the Ukrainian defenses that are being set up in these water barriers, and then the front line will kind of go something like this, because then they'll outflank it and push the Ukrainians away back towards the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk line, and then the front will kind of go like this. So then, this would be, this is kind of the main goal. So the first goal is to reach Porez and Novokalynove here. And then the second, and this has to go in tandem, if they, they have to expand to outflanking these troops here, and then also moving a bit more north to actually cut the highway, which is one of the objectives here. But not only that, reaching Porez will outflank the Ukrainians that are trying to defend Donetsk, or not defend Donetsk, trying to, in this, the Ukrainians have, these two defense lines they were setting up. They had Novopokrovska and Novoselivka-Pershi. They have Sokol, the Sokol defense line. There's actually a very strong defense line right here, and I think you could actually see it in Google here. Yeah, you could see it on Google. Look, this is the Ukrainian defenses here. They have a very strong fortress here that the Ukrainians set up. And, it's a good natural defense line. However, if the Russians manage to reach Porez, or even just they don't have to reach it yet. They could just be continuously pushing along these fields. They could attack it from the north here. And obviously the Ukrainians didn't expect that. They were expecting kind of more of a direct attack, maybe something directly like, from here. Same thing. And then, if the Russians, push, right now the Russians are on the outskirts here. And, but they can't attack directly. Again, they have very strong defenses here. So the Ukrainians are safe from a direct attack. However, the Ukrainians can't stop the Russians pushing here. The Russians will be able to attack from the back and be able to take these villages a lot easier. And then if these villages fall, the same thing happens here. The Russians will be able to attack from the south here and collapse these two villages. And again, it's like a rollover machine. And then if these two villages fall, then, it's a bit of a, the Ukrainians aren't expected to be attacked from the north. They're expecting an attack from the east. And so, again, this is where the Russians will probably try to focus their push. So, we saw the Russians expand out from, take a bunch of fields and tree lines, and now they're on the outskirts of Novokalynove. But we'll see how they could continuously improve upon their offensive, how much they could continue expanding through these fields. But as I said, attacking in the fields is very dangerous in this war. So we'll see if the Russians could actually facilitate all that. On the more southern part of the Donetsk front, the Russians are starting to. One thing I've noticed that the Ukrainians made a bunch of kind of little defense nodes here. They made a defense node here, a defense node here. I don't think you could see it on Google Maps here, so it won't show here. But the Ukrainians basically made some strongholds to prevent the Russians from reaching Kupiansk. The first one fell this week, right here. And the reason why that fell is because it's so close to the front that now that Semnivka and Berezhny have been taken, the Russians can now slowly but surely start pushing to the west and start taking tree line after tree line. And the Ukrainians will still have to continuously fall back. So the Russians are trying to expand the positions away from Semnivka and Berezhny, and the Ukrainians are in a bit of a pickle here, because if the Russians start pushing towards Kupiansk on this other side of the river, the Russians could definitely attack Kupiansk from the south here, and then this double pincer attack will put very strain on Ukrainian defenses in Kupiansk. Again, they're trying to reach the Vojachka River, and then just like these water barriers up here that will slow down the Russians, once they reach the Vojachka River, the Ukrainians could take a breather and be able to hold off any other Russian incursions. But again, so this is where the front line probably will look like. But again, that the Russians don't need to continuously push west. They could outflank it. They could, and the whole purpose was to push the Ukrainians from Donetsk. So they could actually take a breather and maybe take a few months for an operational pause if they want. But I think once they, I think they're going to still push here. And until they push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk, there's still going to be battles for Krasnogorivka, Grigorivka, anything to the east of this red line, the Russians will try to take. But I think once they do that, I don't think the Russians will continue pushing towards Pokrovsk. I think this will be the new defense line, and the Russians will more focus on this area right here. And maybe this is recent. Maybe this is just bias. Maybe I'm just there's a lot of happenings here. But the thing is that there's a way for the Russians to expand here. It's easier to expand here. It's going to be very hard to try to cross this news water barrier to the west. That it's a continuous water barrier. So it really helps the Ukrainians here. So I don't think a direct attack will be feasible. I think we'll see more of a attack this way because there's less water barriers to go through. That's just my opinion. More on this front here is a lot of sources are saying the Russians are now battling for the center of Natalova, and that the eastern part of Natalova has fallen. This is very interesting, and I talked about this last time. Is that I expected Natalova to hold on because they've been fighting Peremyska for such a long time that I thought they had a bunch of defenses here, but it looks like they did not. I was expecting more of a direct attack, kind of like right here, take this area and then they attack from the north, but looks like they could attack directly and still be able to capture it very easy. Now, the center, some Russian sources are saying that the center of Natalova has fallen. I doubt that, because if the center has fallen to the Russians, these high-rise buildings, then it's over for the Ukrainians. There's nothing else. Alright, and so for Natalova, if the center has fallen to the Russians, that means that this was the main defenses of Natalova. If these high-rise buildings fell to the Russians, there's nothing stopping the Russians from taking the rest of Natalova. And basically, so we'll have to get confirmation if the center has fallen. I doubt that, but I could see the eastern, because these are just single little family, town, little homes. They're easy to capture. And I expect the Ukrainians would have fell back to more the defenses of these high-rise buildings. So I think the high-rise buildings are being contested, and I think we won't see, but I'm looking, I might be wrong, but, Natalova is falling a lot quicker than Peremyska did. So we'll see how much the Russians could push here. But if the Russians, regardless, even if they take Natalova, the extent of Russian progress will kind of go probably here, and then that's it. The Russians will push to the Vojachka River, use the river as a defense node, and then just kind of have the defenses be here. So I think the Russians will stop after Natalova. Again, Karlovka will be where the Ukrainian defenses start, and Natalova will be where the Russian defenses start. So the battle for Natalova is continuously is progressing. The Russians took the eastern part. The center is still Russian sources say they took it. I think it's still being contested, but we shall see. So yeah, that's the Donetsk front. One thing of note here is that geolocated footage shows that the Ukrainians are still in Novokalynove. So that's why I'm like, why aren't they connecting? Well, it's because now we got updated information that the that the Ukrainians managed to re-enter this little village. So the Ukrainians now are back here. I kind of think it's more of a, maybe it's like a gray zone. Maybe the Ukrainians enter here, or maybe the Russians enter, but no one actually holds it. Because again, this place has been wiped off the map. There's nothing here anymore, really, because of continuously attacks from both sides. One thing that we have got confirmation on is that the Russians are now back here along this river. So, this push from Peremyska trying to close this pocket here has been confirmed. But it is kind of hard to close this pocket if Novokalynove is still here. So, we shall see what happens. So good thing for the, so looks like Novokalynove is not as secure as we thought for the Russians. So that's something to take into consideration here. One thing that is very interesting as we continue going south here in the Donetsk front is the complete capture of the factory, the Krasnogorivka factory. This was the main stronghold of the Ukrainians, and with the capture, we saw the Russians hoisting their flag in the, I think, center part of this factory. And so with the capture of this factory is a very big deal. A lot of people, kind of a bit going overboard. It's like, oh, this is the end of Krasnogorivka. It is, but it's not like the end yet. The Russians still have a job to do. The Ukrainians aren't just going to be like, oh, we lost our main fortification, we're going to give up. The Ukrainians will fight, but the fall of the factory, which was the main Ukrainian stronghold in this area, basically dooms the city for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians still have, they have these like maybe two-story buildings here, in this like kind of business district right here in the center of the town. But, again, the Russians will be in the more heavily fortified factory, and the factory has higher buildings than these two-story buildings here. And so they'll be able to have a better chance of pushing through here. Along with this, the Russians have this, in this intersection right here that they captured last week, and I expect the Russians to start maybe moving across this park, moving along this residential area, and start outflanking this business district from the east here. And so, from these two attacks, I expect this place to fall. So the capture of this factory has been going on for about like a week or two after the Russians managed to enter it. This was a very big deal. The Russians taking this area is a very, I can't overstate how important it is for the Russians to capture this, or to have captured this. So, unless the Ukrainians mount some counterattack that forces the Russians out of this factory, it's just a matter of time before Krasnogorivka falls, because the Ukrainians had two defenses. They were using the 2014 defense line here, which still kind of holds up. The Russians are managed to capture a part of it here, but they still have, again, it's a bunch of open field. So the Russians attacking directly from the east will be very dangerous for them, and they have these high-rise buildings right here to defend themselves. So they have this defense line, which is which could hold the east for now, but the southern part of the defenses was this factory. And the Russians, from a daring attack, managed to capture this factory, which, was how the Ukrainians were able to hold the south. And now that the south has fallen, the Russians could continuously push north and take this more easily. The one thing the Ukrainians have as their saving grace is that they have a lot of they could defend them. They shouldn't expect a Russian attack from the north here, because again, if the Ukrainians are still battling over Nevsky or Novokalynove, then it's the Russians aren't going to be coming from the north anytime soon. So they could still have supplies coming in. They're not going to be choked out of supplies. It's just that continuously again, there's a bunch of open fields, and Russian drones and everything could knock out these places. It's hard. It's not impossible. They're not cut off, but it's going to be a lot of damage. And now that their main defenses are crumbling, it's going to be hard for the Ukrainians to hold Krasnogorivka. So they still could be supplied, and if it comes necessary, they'll probably be able to retreat to good order to their next defense line here. But so they're not doomed. But the defense here just got a lot weaker, a lot harder. Another thing to keep in mind here is that some sources are saying that the center of Grigorivka has fallen to the Russians. We need some confirmation. Right now, we just have the eastern outskirts. Again, the same thing as Natalova. The center of, but the thing is, I believe this a bit more because again, Grigorivka is doesn't have a bunch of high-rise buildings. They have some farms in the south, but the thing about it is that so it's just a bunch of small buildings. There's maybe a school, one or two big buildings, but I could see the center being captured. Some pro-Russian sources say the center has been captured. I could see that, but we have not got confirmation of that yet. So I'm not saying they captured the center, but I wouldn't be surprised. The capture of Krasnogorivka will also allow the Russians to start pushing along this water barrier, and basically this will cut off whatever this Ukrainian defense on this hill here, and then if this hill falls and the Russians manage to push along this water barrier right here and with this rail line, this basically will facilitate the fall of Grigorivka. And if Krasnogorivka falls, then Grigorivka will fall pretty easily, and I expect the Russians to kind of push right here, and I expect Grigorivka to fall pretty easily, especially if the center has already been captured. Then Grigorivka's time is numbered. I don't expect the Russians to continue pushing towards Novokalynove here, because again, this will expand. This will make a salient, and again, the Russians have Ukrainians have this open field here, and if they continue pushing towards Karakova, their flanks will be exposed. So they need to clear up this area right here. So Grigorivka will be taken, but I think Hostra and Maskulinanovka, the next two towns, will not be assaulted. Well, at least not directly yet. Right after it's not like they're going to continue pushing towards that area. They're not going to stop, but they're going to stop. But it's not like they're just going to wait for a future time for it. So yeah, the southern part is crumbling for the Ukrainians. Let's go to the South Donetsk front here. The Russians are trying to expand their place in the north of Pobeba, trying to basically capture some of these fields to protect their flanks here. And in the southern part of this of Pobeba and the north of Novokalynove, after a week of operational pause, the Russians are back on the offensive. Sources are saying they're now on the outskirts of Pereskolovka here. The Russians have occupied some buildings right here, and if that is true, then I have using this kind of water barrier as a defense. I have no doubt that the Russians will be able to capture this tiny village very quickly. This is kind of like a forward base. The Ukrainians want to hold this so that the Russians don't, because if this gets captured, the Russians will be able to expand here and basically attack from the south here. And then, again, there's a bunch of, these are open fields, but then the Russians will be able to start linking up Pobeba and Perestolovka and Novokalynove. And, the Ukrainians that are defending in these open fields will be crushed from three sides here. And so that's why Perestolovka is important, because if this village falls, the Russians will have an easier time to clear out, these defenses here, and the Ukrainians will have to get pushed back to Konstantinovka and defenses along this road. And so once this flank is secure, the Russians will be able to have a springboard operation to start attacking, be able to start moving through Konstantinovka from the north, and instead of just directly from the south here. There's been some gains here as well. It's hard to quantify, but again, the Russians are trying to expand. The difference between Ukrainian positions here and where the Russians are expanding from Novokalynove and here is kind of foggy. Where we know the Ukrainians hold, somewhere here, and the Russians hold here. Where are the Russians only here? Or are they here? Again, it's very hard to geolocated footage, based on these tree lines where the Russians are. The Syriac has the front line configured like this, and again, being in the open fields is very hard. The Russians, if they want to keep pushing through the south here, are going to be under constant attack by the Ukrainian FPV drones. and so they don't have like a village here that they can use as as an area to secure themselves, and so they can attack Konstantinivka from the south. So, but again, this is the same thing with Novokalynove. The way they'll be able to take Konstantinivka is only from the north here, if they are able to attack from the north and from the south. But again, to attack from the north and the south is to go through fields, and that is a very hard time, as we saw with Novokalynove. So again, the Russians are trying to. They have entered Perestoivo, so clashes for this village are continuing. They are pushing through these fields in a very slow manner. So they are trying to basically develop very slowly and tactically their offensive here. So we'll see what happens as they continue developing their offensive here. We're continuing pushing this way. The battle for Uruzhaina has restarted. The Russians managed to capture the southern outskirts of this village, at least like the farms of this village. The more residential area is still under Ukrainian control. So we'll see what the Russians are trying to plan to do here. I think this is just, again, the Russians have they have a main place they're going to do their offensive, and then they're gonna push everywhere, so that hey, if the Russians weren't pushing here, the Ukrainians would be like, hey, we're just gonna we're gonna pull troops from here to support, say, Russian pushes in Krasnogorivka. But if the Russians are pushing here and starting to threaten Starmayorsk and Uruzhaina, the Ukrainians can't pull units here because they are countering the Russians here. So maybe, I don't think there's some big goal here. I don't think the Russians are trying to break through here, but I think the Russians are just kind of pushing towards Starmayorsk and Uruzhaina because it's a lot easier to pin Ukrainian forces here. So, and this has borne fruit. They have captured the southern farms of Uruzhaina, and we'll see how they develop their offensives to these two villages here. So very good for the Russians here. In the Zaporozhye front, we have some updates. The Russians have, a lot of Russian sources are saying that they have completely captured Robotyne, and but some neutral sources like Syriac here and pro-Ukrainian sources say the Ukrainians still have, that the northern sector is, like this area right here, is either under Ukrainian control or is a gray zone. It's not like the Russians are fortified all the way here, but it's more like no side controls this area. Regardless, though, this is more of a psychological blow. The capture of Robotyne, which isn't a town anymore, it's been wiped off the face of the earth. So there's really no build. There's some small little hobbit holes here, but it's very hard to use this as a defense base. But regardless, capturing this town is a very big morale blow, because if the Russians manage to capture this town here, then the only gain of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in their main direction of attack towards the land bridge has been taken back. So the Russians are, they have basically solidified themselves in the center of Robotyne, and now it's just a battle of securing themselves on the northern part of Robotyne. Some sources say they've already done that, but we'll have to get some more confirmation. But again, I don't think I think the Russians are trying to flatten this area a bit. I think the Russians will try to push towards this massive tree line that kind of connects these two front lines here, and then once they reach this tree line, I think they'll be good. But again, I think the push here is not only to roll back the Ukrainian summer offensive here, but also and eliminate the salient, but also because pushing here will prevent the Ukrainians from moving their forces from Zaporozhye to another front. So if the Russians would let this place be, they could again send forces to Donetsk, for example. But again, the Russians pushing in this area just forces the Ukrainians to hold troops here. So in the Kherson front, the Ukrainians actually have some success here. Before I talked about how Kremik used to be a kind of something mostly taken by the Russians. Well, now the Ukrainians are back in Kremik, and while they have not taken this village, the Russians still hold a part, half of it, maybe more than half. I don't know, but the Ukrainians are back here, and the Ukrainians still have a bit of a bridgehead in this area. So, okay, that's good for the Ukrainians to continue contesting Kremik. So this village has not been recaptured by the Russians. My big thing is, I don't know what's the purpose of it. I don't know why. Are the Ukrainians trying to pin Russian forces in Kherson, trying to keep them on the toes? I don't know. But the Ukrainians are contesting Kremik. They're not giving up that village just yet. So we got confirmation that they are still in that village and trying to have a little bit of a small bridgehead. Let's go north now. Let's talk about Chasiv Yar. A lot of focus has been focused on, a lot of has been focused on how a lot of sources are saying that the battle for Chasiv Yar is like now they're trying to, there's a lot of artillery bombings, fab strikes, drone strikes, a lot of assault operations, and so it's very it's interesting to see how there's a lot of like craze on Telegram and such about how they're battling here. But with that being said, there's been only small gains. One of the biggest gains, however, is confirmation that the Russians have completely captured this nature preserve and have reached the Donetsk Canal here. This secures the southern area here, and they'll be able to attack this area right here directly. The Russians are also trying to push and are doing assault operations in this northern sector right here. There's been, they're trying to push along through this forest and to enter this residential area so that they could have, they could attack this this canal zone right here from the north. So, but this is where a lot of the fighting is going on. The Russians have finished their battle for the south here. And now they just need to have a northern sector here so that they could squeeze the Ukrainians out. And right now, I think they're not going to try to take Chasiv Yar. Right now, the whole point is to reach the Siversk and Donetsk Canal so that then they are on equal height with the Ukrainians, and then they could start doing a second phase to actually take Chasiv Yar itself. However, the focus right now is in the north here, and the Ukrainians are holding on very doggedly here. The Ukrainians have this hill here. They have, these positions in this farm in here, they have this forest here. So the Russians are trying to push very hard here, and they're trying to reach Kalynova, but it's, trying to take Kalynova is a very big pain for the Russians. And, we've only had minimal small gains here for the Russians. So we'll have to see if the Russians could continue, somehow make a breakthrough in Kalynova, but they have to take this village in order to squeeze out the Ukrainians from this high-rise canal zone here, which is an extension of Chasiv Yar. The Russians are making, so they're pushing very hard in the north, but making very slow progress. The Russians are also pushing in the south, having some progress here, managed to they reached here, and I would not be surprised if they, maybe as the Russians are pushing here, maybe they start attacking south a little bit, and, maybe trying to start battles for this forest right here. So we'll see how that expands. So the Russians are doing very good in the south, and the Russians are a bit struggling in the north, trying to break through here. But if they do break through towards Kalynova, they'll be able to squeeze out the Ukrainians from this this canal zone and force them back to the center of Chasiv Yar. There's been no real changes on the Siversk front, really. No changes. There's been no changes on the Lyman front. The one thing to note here is some sources are showing that the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians away from the outskirts of Terny. Not all, they haven't negated most of the Russian progress as they approached here. They have, but again, there's been attacking through these open fields was like very tough for the Russians. So, reaching Terny, I think has been very bad. They've not been able to reach it. In fact, the Ukrainians managed to push them away from the village. So, kind of a little bit of a bad luck for the Russians in Lyman. One thing that is very interesting, however, is this. I don't know if we talked about this last week, but the Russians have activated in the Kupiansk front, and I don't know if this was just an opportunistic push or whatnot, but the Ukrainians managed to lose one of their major defenses here. And I think I talked about this, how the loss of this loss of these defenses here will force the Ukrainians to go back to Kupiansk. I think what happened is a lot of sources have been saying that the Ukrainians have been pulling units from the Kupiansk front and sending them to Chasiv Yar to shore up that defenses. And, that helped. That helped prevent the fall of Chasiv Yar. Well, at least, not to have Chasiv Yar fall immediately. But again, when you weak one front, that allows the Russians to exploit that area. And the Russians managed to exploit that by pushing and start battles for these four villages here. And I'm going to talk about this area for a second here. The Russians managed to push through the Ukrainian defenses in Klishivka and occupy about 2/3 of the village. The big unknown is what's happening in these outskirts here, but I have no doubt that now that the Russians have established themselves on the other side of the rail line, they'll be able to push the Ukrainians out of here, and they'll be able to use this rail line as like a northern defense from Ukrainian positions in these two villages. So Klishivka has basically fallen. One thing of confirmation is the village of Klotorovka, which helped to defend the Ukrainians from the south here, from the Russian attacks from the south, has been taken. Because not only were the Russians already in the south here, with the fall of Klishivka from the north, there's double-edged like attack that forced the Ukrainians back, and so the village of Klotorovka has fallen. This village has fallen. Klishivka has basically fallen, and so you might be wondering what's next. I think my guess is that's what's happened. The Russians will continue pushing along this rail line, kind of reach maybe this intersection here, and kind of. Let me show you what I think is going to happen. Now, we talked about this a few months ago, early in the winter, but the Russians also pushed here and managed to take this small little town here and Tabivka here. But, and the reason why this is important is because there's like some ravines here, some little forest belts that allow the Russians to hold this position here. And so, not only will this secure the flank here, if they manage to reach here and kind of like do something like this, the Russians will be able to outflank the next two Ukrainian defenses here, and they'll be able to attack Stepo, Novosilivka, and Ivanivka from the south here, and from the north, and then also directly. And so this squeeze will force the Ukrainians out of here, and I bet the Russians will try to push something like this, and this will be the new defense line here. So the Russians are going to clear up Klishivka and Klotorovka, and then start battles for these two villages. And if these two villages fall, I think then the Russians will stop. Because here's the thing. Let's say the Russians finish their tactical goal and reach something like this, right? This is big, because this was the main Ukrainian defenses that stopped the Russians from pushing towards Kupiansk. Because the next Ukrainian defenses, once these four villages fall, is... so the Ukrainians have positions here, they have Sinkovka. Sinkovka is kind of like the northern, like if Sinkovka falls, then the Russians will start battling for the northern part of the Kupiansk. If these four villages fall, then the Russians will be, the next Ukrainian defense line is in the southern Kupiansk region, this area right here. And, and the northern Kupiansk direction is here. But again, Ukrainian positions in Sinkovka have been holding up, so the Russians haven't been battling for that. The thing about this, though, is that if these four villages fall, is that there's just a bunch of open fields until the Russians reach, the Ukrainian positions in the southern part of Kupiansk. This is Kupiansk, and there's a bunch of other like towns and such that as its suburbs. But again, as we saw in Lyman, attacking, if they want to continuously expand their offensive, across these fields, it's going to be a very tough time. They're going to be drone struck. It's going to be very, very hard for the Russians to attack through here. So I don't expect the Russians, I think the Russians will take these four villages just to secure themselves here. But then after that, I expect the Russians to stop. Because if they want to break through towards Kupiansk, there needs to be a better way to do it. I think it'll be more in the center here. There'll be some push towards Borova, and using these villages as kind of like places to hold, like kind of settle down, they'll be able to push and have this extension, and then be able to move upwards, north or south, and then Russian troops in other places in the Kupiansk front will be able to squeeze the Ukrainians away. So they'll have to be, I don't think the breakthrough will be here. I think the Russians are just trying to push the Ukrainians, trying to capture this like stronghold here, these like stronghold of villages here. So a lot of progress for the Russians in the Kupiansk front. So that's what's happening. So that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. The Russians are advancing everywhere. The Russian summer offensive, we don't know when it's going to start, where it's going to happen. Maybe it already started, who knows. Maybe it's a small one. Maybe it's actually a big arrow offensive. Ukrainians are trying to hold on. So we'll see how the Russians continue expanding their, continuously developing their offensives. So be sure to subscribe to this channel if you want to continue seeing videos similar to, if you want to continue following the Russian Ukrainian War. Give this video a like, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and aim high and wander on.